Once again, Professor Collins, thank you for your kindness to give us an interview. The publisher is very he's been asking me to get this interview going, and because I believe that according to him and to my research, is that this is the first time we you are being interviewed to an Spanish speaking audience, and so we're introducing what I have said many times. One of the main luminaries regarding apocalyptic literature of our day, and hopefully your book, the Apocalyptic Imagination, but well, in English as is on the third edition already. So we have translated from the third edition. So you have your latest edition available to the Spanish speaking readers. But a question that I did that now came into my mind actually, um, why did you come to the third edition? Uh, the demand is so
Oh,
great.
no, it's a matter of updating it.
Oh, okay.
Actually, at present, the publisher asked me to do a fourth edition or a shorter form of it, and I didn't really want to do that. But what I am working on is a little supplementary volume, a
No,
small
okay.
supplementary volume to discuss some issues that have come up.
Mm,
Now, these are generally a step beyond what's in this book,
mm.
because this is meant as an introduction.
Just an
And,
introduction,
and
which is very
so,
long.
I think maybe we should probably stay on the introductory level for
Okay.
this. So,
Mhm.
for example, if we start with the question of what is apocalyptic literature,
Well, thank you. Thank
uh,
you.
well, one of the things that has come up is some people then dispute that, and then that gets a little bit complicated. And so I think we maybe we'll stick with the first level.
Yes.
So, what a lot of my work on the apocalyptic literature goes back to a project in the 1970s
Mm,
that five of us were involved in, outlining apocalypse as a genre. It was part of a project on forms and genres of literature. There was another project on parables and one on pronouncement texts, and apocalypse was our one.
mm,
What we did at that time was we went through all the literature that gets called apocalyptic and tried to decide then how much of that really is coherent. Now, to back up one step, why is any literature called apocalyptic? Well, it's because of the last book in the Bible, the
mm.
Apocalypse of John. And that's called in Greek an apocalypsis, which means revelation. But now, not all revelation counts as an apocalypse. So, in practice, what the word means is revelations that are somewhat like what you get in the book of Revelation.
Mm.
Now, I say somewhat because you may have considerable variety, but there are certain things that are staples. And what first thing is, it's got to be a revelation. It's not a prophecy.
Mm.
In the Old Testament, a prophet gets up and says, "Hear the word of the Lord." Now, you may get an occasional prophetic pronouncement like that in an apocalypse, but mostly what you'll find is that somebody falls asleep and has a vision, and an angel has to explain it to him, or he's taken up out of his body and taken up through the heavens. So it's an extraordinary revelation,
Mm.
out of this world, if you like. Now,
So,
that's one
yeah,
of, yeah,
yeah. No, so that's the big difference between apocalyptic and prophetic, as you said.
yes, yeah.
Oh.
That's one big difference. There are
Mm.
others. Now, then, secondly, the content is also distinctive. And there are two kinds of things that you get in apocalypses, and I distinguish these as two subtypes. Some people would prefer to call them two different genres altogether, but one of them has to do with history. Now, this is very familiar, say, from the book of Daniel. Daniel sees four great beasts coming up out of the sea. And these represent the whole sweep of history from the time of the Babylonian exile forward. And then at the end of that, there is a big judgment.
Mm.
Now, very often the history will be divided into periods. The book of Revelation now doesn't go that far, doesn't follow all of that, and that there were reasons for that. But this is the typical thing now in the Jewish apocalypses. History, long sweep of history divided into periods, ending with a judgment. And most crucially, the judgment then is followed by resurrection. Or I should say, the resurrection comes first, and the resurrection is followed by the judgment. Uh, Now, this is the big difference over against prophecy.
Mm.
You see, most of the Hebrew Bible, you really do not have an expectation of a meaningful afterlife. In the Hebrew Bible, when you die, you go to Sheol.
Mm.
And Sheol is like a damp basement, and you'd be better off dead, so to speak. But you can't even praise the Lord in Sheol, according to the
Mm.
Old Testament. And it's only in the book of Daniel that you get a resurrection of the dead, and then a distinguished afterlife where some people are rewarded, some people, in effect, go to heaven, and some people go to hell. And
Mm.
it's in the apocalyptic literature that we first get that idea. So that's the historical type. Then the other type, which you get first of all in the book of Enoch, where he is taken up on a cloud up to heaven, and then an angel escorts him off to get some kind of guided tour of the universe. You can imagine him going around in a helicopter,
Mm.
and all sorts of things are pointed out to him. In some of the later ones, they're taken up then through a numbered series of heavens. In the historical ones, history is divided into periods. In the cosmological ones, the space is divided into different levels, and typically 7 heavens, and then God will be up there in the seventh. There are a few variations on that, but that's the typical thing. Also, there, one of the main items of interest in what he sees when he goes up into the heavens is what happens to people after they die.
Mm.
Where do they go? And actually, in some of those apocalypses, and I'm thinking now of ones that are relatively late, say 100 AD or later, uh, often hell is up in one of the heavens.
Mm. No.
Hell has actually been transposed. Everything is up there.
Mm.
So that's by and large the shape of apocalyptic literature. Now, this wasn't recognized as a separate kind of literature until at the early 1800s. And what happened was, everybody knew the book of Daniel, but Daniel appears in the Old Testament as a book of prophecy. And the book of Revelation is obviously, to some degree, modeled on Daniel. Beasts coming up out of the sea and that kind of
Mm.
thing. Now, but in the late 18th century, a Scottish traveller named James Bruce went to Ethiopia, and he got his hands on apparently 4 copies of the books of Enoch, of the Book of Enoch in Ethiopic. Now, he put one of those in the Bodleian Library at Oxford. He put one in Paris. One I forget where he put, and he gave one to the Pope.
Mm.
So if you have Protestant friends, be sure to
Mm.
tell them that.
Yes.
That actually wasn't so well publicized at the time.
Mm.
But now the one that was taken to Oxford was translated then in, I think it was 1819 to begin with. And, then after a little while, people began to take note of this. And a German scholar said, it's not only the book of Daniel that's like Revelation. This stuff in the book of Enoch has a lot in common with the two. And
Mm.
then there was another text known as Fourth Ezra or Second Esdras, which you get in Latin, and you would get in the Vulgate, for example. It's preserved. This also is a similar kind of work. Some of the Sibylline oracles, which we may come back to talk to.
Yeah.
And so he put together a group of these. And that was really the first time somebody recognized that this is a genre, which is to say, it's a kind of literature with recognizably distinct types. And you see, it's enormously important for the New Testament
Mm.
because there is implicit in it a worldview. Now, by a
Mm.
worldview, I mean certain assumptions about time and space. The assumption about time is that time is spread out over the longue durée, and this can all be foretold because it's really determined in advance how this is going to go. And it will end up with a big judgment. And in terms of space, it is a space where there's a lot more going on in the heavens than there is on earth, where there are all sorts of angels and demons, and there are layers of heaven up there, and they're all populated. And the goal of life is to get up there. Whereas in the Old Testament, the goal of life was to see your children and your children's children. But that changed. And you see, that change came into Judaism first. Some parts, most of the book of Enoch, in fact, seems to be older than the book of Daniel.
Mm. Okay.
So, it used to be thought that we know when the book of Daniel in its final edition was written. And, for the benefit of any conservative Protestant friends you may have, it was not written during the Babylonian exile.
Mm.
It
Okay.
was clearly written in the second century BC, at
Mhm.
the time when there was a persecution in Jerusalem, where there was an attempt to suppress the Jewish cult and really to suppress Jewish identity. Uh, that's when Daniel was written. This was about 164.
Mm.
We can date it actually. We can maybe talk more about this if you like, as to how we know when it was written. But it's because you have prophecies that are very exact down to a certain point, and then were not fulfilled beyond that.
Mm.
And already in antiquity, some people figured out that's actually when it was written. That all the accurate prophecies were written after the fact.
Mm.
And then the rest was the projection. But some parts of the book of Enoch are older than that. Some of them may go back to the 3rd century BC. And it turns out, I think, that what led to the rise of this kind of literature was the spread of Hellenistic culture.
Mm.
And this was, there had been a big series of world empires, as you read in Daniel, with the Assyrians and the Babylonians and the Persians and so forth. But the Greeks were different. This was a very different kind of culture, much more technologically advanced,
Mm.
uh, much much looser attitudes with regard to the body and sex and things like
Mm.
that. And I think uh, this Hellenistic culture hit the Middle East much the way Western culture has hit it in modern times.
Mm.
Something that is quite alien and different. And then people react to that in different ways. Some people may like it and try to acquire it. And a lot of people just react against it and say, hell no, we're going to stick to our traditional ways of doing it. And actually, if you read anything now on post colonialism, you know that there's always a little bit of both.
Mm. Yes.
That there's a theorist named Homi Bhabha who writes about hybridity.
Mm.
Even when people are reacting against Hellenistic culture, they pick up parts of it. And this is also true still in the
Like
book.
Spanish speaking people, we always bang the Spaniards for conquering us, but we love going to Spain and we love their culture.
Yeah, yeah. And there's always a mixture in it. So I think that was really what gave the impetus to the rise of this
Mm.
new view of the world.
Mm.
So where should we go from there? Should we talk
Well,
more about Enoch or about
actually, both Enoch and Daniel, if you notice, I put both of them together. And
yeah,
the dating of Daniel, it's such a fascinating thing. And Enoch, but Enoch did, we knew of Enoch. We didn't have we didn't have the book. How did that happen?
yeah.
Because that's what I understood from what you said. We knew about Enoch, but didn't have the text.
Well, we have the whole book of Enoch in Ethiopic.
Mm.
The Ethiopic was translated from the Greek, which we don't have except for a few small bits of it. And the Greek was probably translated from the Aramaic.
Mm.
And we didn't have any of the Aramaic until the Dead Sea Scrolls were found.
Okay.
And when the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, lo and behold, there were bits of several parts of the Book of Enoch. Now, people had already realized long before the Dead Sea Scrolls that the Book of Enoch is really 5 books put together. Some people thought this was done deliberately to make it kind of like the 5 books of Moses.
Mm.
I'm not sure about that, but there are at least 5 different compositions in it.
Like Psalms.
Yeah. Yeah.
Same
Now,
idea.
yeah. What one of these is a book about the stars, an astronomical book. Most people, to be honest, find it extremely boring.
Mm.
But obviously some people were into this, and in fact, it reflects some of the Babylonian ideas about the stars. It was a little bit out of date, I think, when the
Mm.
astronomical book of Enoch was written. But when the first thing you think of when you talk about Enoch is the first part of the book, the first 36 chapters, known as the Book of the
Mm.
Watchers.
Mhm.
Now, in the book of Genesis, in chapter 6, there is a famous episode when the sons of God, and he did have
Right.
sons, looked down and saw the daughters of men, and you can guess what happens after that. They
Mm.
come down and they form liaisons with them, and they explain, they disclose certain mysteries to them. They teach people how to work iron. They teach them how to make jewelry, the art of making up the eyes. And
Mm.
the book of Enoch says, and there was much fornication. So these come down, then the children that they beget are huge. They're giants, and they eat too much, and they spread violence on earth. And in general, you have a mess. Now, this is told in the book of Enoch. Uh, this goes far beyond what you have in Genesis.
Mhm.
Genesis is very short. Genesis is so short that you figure there must have been a longer story.
Mm.
But now whether this was the longer story, we don't really know. But as developed in the book of Enoch, this becomes the explanation for everything that's wrong with the world. And so then you have a story of how the earth cries out to God, and the angels go up to God and say, for God's sake, will you do something about this?
Mhm.
And so he does, and he sends the flood. Now, that act, in Genesis, the flood comes right after these people come down. But Genesis doesn't say that the flood was punishment for what
Mm.
the fallen angels did, whereas that connection is clearly made in the book of Enoch. Now, that in all probability is a kind of first run for
Mm.
history, if you like. you know, and it's an allegory for what was going to happen again. I think that probably the story of the fallen angels or the sons of God, that these a loose allegory for the Greeks,
Mm,
not a point by point allegory, but it's describing the kind of culture shock caused by people who come in, have much looser attitudes to sexuality and the like, and much more know how with working metals and making jewelry and all of that. So I think that's really what was going on there. But
mm,
then after that, Enoch, the Watchers call on Enoch to intercede for them.
mm.
And Enoch, we're told, was a scribe, and which means, in effect, he was a lawyer. And
Yes.
the Watchers, the fallen angels, tried to hire him as their lawyer. And so he's taken up to heaven. But the case doesn't succeed because uh, God tells him, go back and tell the Watchers, you had it good. You were in heaven. You could have lived forever. But instead, you were attracted by the flesh.
Mm,
And so, you gave up heaven for sex, in effect, is what he tells them. And
mm,
so he goes back and gives them the bad news on that. But then an angel takes him on a tour where he sees all sorts of cosmological curiosities, but he also sees the chambers where the souls of the dead are kept. And he
mm,
sees the place where the fallen angels will be punished. And he sees uh, actually the old Garden of Eden
mm,
also, which is not really, that doesn't explain the problems of the world in the Book of Enoch.
mm.
In the Book of Enoch, it's the fallen angels who put the world wrong.
Yes, I heard Ed Wright say that, and many others the same, that in this type of literature, it's not human sin that put us in this predicament, but it was
Right?
the angels.
Yeah, yeah. And equally, you don't get out of this predicament just by human agency.
Mm,
You need a heavenly deliverer.
mm.
Now, that might be a good point to switch over to the book of Daniel.
Okay.
Now, the book of Daniel is a very complex book. Part of it, about half of it, is in Aramaic, and the other half in Hebrew. And I think it's obvious that it wasn't all composed at the same time.
Mm,
And the usual breakdown is that more or less the first half of the book, which are the stories about the lion's den and the fiery furnace and all that stuff, that stuff is older.
mm,
And those are traditional stories. As in the case of Nebuchadnezzar's madness, we can trace the development of the story a bit because there is a very similar story found at Qumran, where it's a different Babylonian king, but
mm,
and we know where this story came from. It was a Babylonian king who left Babylon and went out to Tema in the wilderness. And that's really what prompted this whole story. But then,
mm,
it changes as it goes along. Now, most of those stories in the first half of Daniel aren't what we would call apocalyptic.
mm,
They're stories, legends, usually culminating in some kind of a miracle, like the fiery furnace or the
yes.
lion's den. The one thing in those chapters that is important for the apocalyptic literature is in chapter 2, and that's the famous vision of the statue, of
Mm,
Nebuchadnezzar's statue, which represents four kingdoms. And that at least will be taken up and used in the second half of the book. But then, beginning in chapter 7, Daniel, the whole thing kind of changes. Up to this point, there are stories about Daniel, and it's after from Daniel 7 on that they begin reporting Daniel's visions.
mm,
Even in chapter 2, it's the king who has the vision, and Daniel is called on to explain it. But beginning in chapter 7, it's Daniel who has the vision, and he needs an angel to explain it. And, in chapter 2, the four kingdoms are represented by a statue with four metals of declining value. but it's very orderly.
Mm.
In chapter 7, there are four great beasts coming up out of the sea.
Mm.
And if you read Daniel chapter 7 and take it seriously, it's a nightmare. If you put yourself in
Yes.
Daniel's position, it's terrifying. And then, the fourth beast then is trampling everything with its feet. And that we now recognize as an allusion to the Seleucid kings. These were the Greeks in Syria,
Mm.
used elephants in warfare.
Mm.
That's where this image of trampling comes from.
Okay. Yes.
That the thought of having war elephants trampling all over you. So, but then in Daniel, the scene changes and he sees one like a son of man coming on the clouds of heaven. One of the most famous lines in all of Scripture.
Yes.
And now, he comes to the Ancient of Days. The oddity of this passage, if you come to this from the Hebrew Bible, is that before this in the Hebrew Bible, whenever you see somebody riding on the clouds, it is Yahweh, the God of Israel,
Mm. Yes.
always. But here, there's another God above him, the Ancient of Days. Now, this is very much like what you have in the old Canaanite myths, where El was the venerable ancient god and Baal was the storm god. Now, it's not Baal, obviously, in Daniel, but I think what it turns out to be is the Archangel Michael,
Mm.
who is, if you like, the second power in heaven.
Mm.
Not a god on a par with the Most High, but not a human being. Now, this is now a controversial issue. We
Yes.
tend to speak about angels and the like. Even in the Dead Sea Scrolls, they call what we call angels, they call gods.
Mm.
So, there are higher gods and lesser gods. And you always have lesser gods in the Bible. And indeed, in later times too. But certainly in the apocalyptic literature, there are lots of divine beings up there. Some are more divine than others.
Mm.
So, it's not disputing the supremacy of the supreme God,
Mm-hmm.
but still, uh, in this case, Michael is said to be the Prince of Israel. And the prince there means the patron angel. And as the angel explains it to Daniel, the battle that's going on in heaven, the real battle,
Mm.
isn't just the one between Greeks and Jews on earth. The real battle is in heaven between the prince of Greece and the prince of Israel. And that at the end of that, Michael will arise. And it's after that then that you get the resurrection. Now, what you do in the meantime? Daniel, we know, was written around the time of the Maccabean revolt.
Mm.
And there were different schools of thought among the Maccabees, among the Jews of the time, as to how you should react. If
Mm.
a pagan king comes in and disrupts the cult in the temple, what do you do? Well, the Maccabees said, you get your sword.
Mm.
And then when it turns out that the Syrians know enough to attack them on the Sabbath, and some people wouldn't fight on the Sabbath, well, tough. So the Maccabees said, we'll fight on the Sabbath. We can break one commandment and stay alive to keep the rest of them. That was the Maccabean way of looking at it. But the way they look at it in the book of Daniel is we are not the ones who are going to defeat the Greeks. It's God and the Archangel Michael.
Mm-hmm.
And so what we need to do is keep ourselves pure. Not make sure we don't participate in pagan sacrifices or the like, and that you need to understand what's going on. And that's what they say at the end of Daniel, that those who are wise will instruct the many. The maskilim, as they're called in Hebrew. And
mm,
what it means to be wise here means to understand what's really going on, to
mm,
understand that the real battle is in heaven. And also that this is all under control, that God has already decided how long this can go on. And in one chapter, there's a famous reinterpretation in Daniel chapter 9 of a prophecy of Jeremiah that said that Jerusalem would be desolate for 70 years.
mm.
And the angel explains to Daniel, well, actually, it's 70 weeks of years, which is to say 490 years. But then they were a little bit, they weren't very clear on how much time had passed actually since the Babylonian exile. And so, but the main point was you're now in the last half week. And several times in the book of Daniel, it says there will be a time, times, and half a time, which is to say
Mm,
3.5 years. Now, and at the end of the book of Daniel, then they actually give specific numbers of days until the end. And they do that twice. And I figured the second time is a slightly higher number. And I figured that was an extension because the first one passed. But Daniel is the only apocalyptic book that tries to do that
mm,
tries to predict when the end will happen, because it never does. At least not yet.
yes.
Yeah.
It's very interesting. But can you just to finish on Daniel? Can you just because you mentioned that you know that the dating is around 165
Oh,
due
yeah.
to due to other factors. Can you just because this is like in the Spanish speaking community, this is like and I guess also in the English speaking community because I know about that. It's a great discussion about it. So
Well, I mean, for what I would call critical scholars,
mm,
this issue was settled a long time ago.
yes.
But there were huge battles fought over this in the 19th century. There was a professor at Oxford named Pusey, who was, what we would call a fundamentalist.
Mm,
He was a learned man, you know, but he just could not believe. Uh, he said, if this isn't right, then Daniel must have lied on a frightful scale.
mm,
And that, I think, is way too simple a way to look at it. But what was recognized, you see, already in antiquity is in chapter 11, there is the angel explains to Daniel what is written in the book of truth, as he
mm,
calls it. That is to say, everything that's now going to happen. And he goes down, he talks about the king of the north, and that's the king of Syria, and the king of the
mm,
south, and that's the king of Egypt. And then there shall arise in his place, well, first of all, here, it's one, in his place shall arise a contemptible person on whom royal majesty has not been conferred. And this is,
mm,
it's very transparent that this is Antiochus Epiphanes.
mm,
I mean, even people who think that the book that this was written back at the time of the Babylonian exile know that it's talking about Antiochus
mm,
Epiphanes and what he did in the second century. And it goes on with his career, and how he will take action against the Holy Covenant, as he puts it, and some people will fall victim. And then the king will act as he pleases. But then it says, at the time of the end, the king of the south will attack him, and it claims that this king will die between the sea and the holy mountain,
mm,
which is to say, in the land of Israel. And he didn't,
mm,
you know, he didn't. He died off over in Persia. And that's how we know, that this was written after the last events that are accurately described in this prophecy and before the prophecy goes off the rails.
Mhm.
So, then you see what you've got to realize is that this prophecy after the fact was a literary convention. It was a device. It's not fair to say that it was lying. This was a style of writing. It was like
Mhm.
fiction. Now, did they all take it literally? That we don't really know. I imagine some people did and some people didn't. Uh, but in any case, I think it's fairly clear that the book of Daniel knows what would happen
Mm.
in the years 168 and 167 down to 164 BC. Now, if you take, as some fundamentalists would
Mm.
claim that this was actually all revealed to Daniel, you have to ask yourself then, why did God reveal to Daniel what would happen in a couple of years in the 160s BC and nothing after that?
Mm. Yes.
So this, I think, doesn't really make sense.
It's like he just talk about the end of history, and that's
Yeah,
it. And he went
yeah.
beyond. So can we say this is that apocalyptic literature is also like theologizing history?
Oh, absolutely,
Mm.
absolutely. But now, of course, it's expecting the end of history right away.
Mhm.
There, and this is actually the first case we have of that phenomenon of people really expecting the end and counting the days to it.
Mm.
And in every century since then, people have tried to reinterpret Daniel chapter 9 so that it could
Yes.
be fulfilled in their time. The last time I'm aware of was about 10 years ago. There was a man in
Mm.
California named Harold Camping
Oh yes, yes.
who set a date.
We knew
The
him.
famous
Yeah.
one was in the 1840s with the,
Yes.
with the Millerites.
Yes.
And, days come and go. As I say, maybe sometime somebody will actually get it right, but
Mm.
not so far.
I,
So
I
I
I live.
think when this goes on for a couple of thousand years, you got to figure maybe
Yes.
this isn't the right way to interpret it.
Or to approach it. Well, some people would like to make money out of this, out of
Oh, yes.
fear, out of fear. There's a
Oh,
series
yeah.
of books that have
Yes.
made millions and millions of dollars. So
Did you ever hear of a book called The Late Great Planet Earth?
yes, it came out the year I was born,
Oh, yeah.
so I know about it.
Yes. Uh,
So
and
the
then
author has
that
continued.
that went through, I forget how many editions, maybe 13 or
Oh wow.
14. And he kept updating the prophecy,
Mm.
which it was a very apocalyptic thing to do.
Yes, I would say so. Yes, I would say so. Yeah.
Because as in Daniel, so uh, in the book of Daniel it figures Jerusalem is still desolate, and it's been a lot more than 70 years since the time of Jeremiah, so it must be 70 weeks of years.
Mm.
So if the way you understood it doesn't fit, reinterpret it.
Yes.
And you treat this language as very malleable symbols like that.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's very easy to cop out. Yeah, I didn't get it right this time, but next time I'll do it. John, can you tell us, because just to move this along, um, uh, there are three types of literatures that you discuss in your book: Civilian Oracles, the Book of Jubilees, and the Dead Sea Scrolls. Can you give us a small introduction to each of
Okay,
these
I,
literature,
I,
please?
I can see we are running low on time,
Yes.
so I'll be very brief.
And let me tell you, not because of Professor Collins, it's because of me. I have to go to work. It's
Sure, yeah, yeah,
4:43
yeah.
a.m. in Australia.
Anyway, I think an hour is enough
Yes,
on anything.
yes, yes.
But
Okay.
Sibylline oracles were written in Greek. Now, some of them are properly apocalyptic. They're all loosely related. They're all oracles. They're not visions like you have in Daniel and Enoch.
Mm,
So they're not apocalyptic revelations in that sense. These are inspired prophecy. The interesting thing about them is they're in the name of the Sibyl. Now, the Sibyl was a figure of Greek mythology, a
Mm.
woman, who had asked Apollo for for lasting life, but didn't ask him to stay young.
Mm.
And, and so she also has a very dim view of life, perhaps for that reason.
Mm.
And a lot of these oracles predict a long sweep of history, often 10 generations or something like that, and some kind of a judgment at the end of it. Not all of them have the resurrection, but the later ones do.
Mm.
These, I think, when the Jews took this over, these were mainly Jews in Egypt, in Alexandria, who spoke Greek, and they were trying to make, trying to find common ground with the Greeks. So they have elements of what we have in apocalyptic literature. It's not quite the same thing.
Mm.
And they become a bit more apocalyptic as you go along. The Book of Jubilees is also a very difficult book to classify because it's really a retelling of the Book of Genesis.
Mm.
But this retelling is presented as having been revealed to Moses on Mount Sinai by an angel. So that's kind of like an apocalypse. And then there is one bit in it in chapter 23 that prophesies the end of history and the resurrection. And that also, so, it kind of frames its retelling of Genesis in an apocalyptic way. But again, it's not, I mean, you could call it an apocalypse, but it's an unusual apocalypse. Or you could say it's really a book of mixed genre. It depends which way you look at it. It's a very interesting book because it tells you a lot about the way they were interpreting scripture in the 2nd century BC. But it's not a typical apocalypse. It
Mm.
just has some apocalyptic elements. Now, the Dead Sea Scrolls, much more important
Mm. Okay.
because this was we had no literature really in Hebrew or Aramaic. I mean, practically none. Between the end of the Bible and the rise of the rabbinic literature, almost 400 years later, until the Dead Sea Scrolls, and then you get fragments of close to 1,000
Mm.
texts. So huge cornucopia of material. Now, they include fragments of the books of Enoch, and they had copies of Daniel, and they had other books with a figure named Daniel.
Mm.
So other revelations to Daniel. Uh, but apart from that, they do not, the people who collected these scrolls, and we think they were the Essenes,
Mm.
a sect, they did not write apocalypses. They had beliefs that were very similar. They had what I would call the apocalyptic worldview.
Mm.
But they often express that using different kind of mythology. The most famous one is that when God made the world, he gave people two spirits to walk in. How would you know that? Well, presumably somebody would have to reveal it to you, but they don't describe how they got the revelation.
Mm.
They just present this as teaching. And then you have two spirits fighting each other, but at an appointed time, God will intervene and destroy the spirit of darkness. And you have this in the community rule. You also have it in a text called the War Scroll, which is about the final battle of the sons of light against the sons of darkness. This idea that the world is divided between two equally balanced forces of light and darkness, you get that in Zoroastrianism.
Mm.
Now, the Jews had been subject to the Persians for a couple of hundred years. And even after that, Jews, especially in the Eastern diaspora, would have had contact with them. I don't think it's difficult to see how they would have gotten such ideas. And of course, they weren't just taking over the Persian ideas, they were refashioning them, they were just using the language. But that's what you get in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, also, that you have a strong belief that eventually the destiny of the righteous is to be with the angels in heaven,
Mm.
and at the idea that the wicked will suffer eternal damnation. But they do not in the sectarian scrolls, the ones that are clearly written within this movement. They do not talk about resurrection. They do not talk about bodies coming back on earth. That doesn't
Mm.
seem to be what they had in mind. So, you have the scrolls fill out a lot of the world view of the times, but from a literary point of view, that they don't give you many apocalypses, and those that they do give you are very fragmentary,
Mm.
which is very frustrating.
Um, I'm very struck about the Sibylline oracles because Jews took up certain things from their surroundings and just and same as the apocalypse as you mentioned regarding Zoroastrian beliefs,
Yeah.
and they incorporate them and reinterpret them for their own benefit.
Yeah.
Uh,
So there are a lot of scholars who just can't accept that.
mm,
They say Jews wouldn't take over ideas from Persians. Eh, this is nonsense. People take over ideas from all sorts of people.
mm,
It doesn't mean you agree with them.
yes, yeah.
You're taking the ideas and you use them.
Mm.
So,
I'd like to move on to the Book of Revelation, which let me tell you, I know that your wife has written a lot about it. So
but
you're a
let,
team.
let
You're
me
a
just
team, yeah.
talk quickly. The book of Revelation, is, I mean, obviously, if you've read Daniel, you immediately recognize a lot of the genre of Revelation.
Mm,
So, in this case, the difference is that this presupposes the resurrection of Christ.
mm,
So, Christ is now ascended to heaven. He is the lamb that was slain, but the lamb
mm,
that was slain is now a lion. Now, this becomes complex because, the bottom line of the book towards the end is that the word comes back from heaven on a white horse with the
mm,
sword of his mouth for striking down the nations. And
yes.
he's nothing like the Jesus in the Gospels.
Mm.
You know, he has Jesus in the Gospels was a nice guy. You
Yes.
wouldn't want to cross this guy who comes back on the white horse.
Mm,
He has undergone a severe character change in the meantime. So, and what has happened actually, is I think that Jesus has been refashioned in the likeness of the kind of Messiah most Jews were expecting,
mm,
who would be a violent warrior. Now, a lot of the book of Revelation, you see, is reacting to Rome. A lot of it is reacting to the destruction of Jerusalem. So, whether you can even distinguish Jews and Christians in the New Testament period is a controversial issue
mm.
because the Christians, as we call them, were all Jews. And the author of Revelation most certainly was a Jew and thought of himself as a Jew. But, he was a Jew who believed that Jesus was the Messiah.
Yes.
And this was it. And so it becomes very anti imperial. But in spite of all of that, there's also a lot of Greek and Roman mythology worked into it and the symbolism. That's what my wife wrote her dissertation about,
Okay.
combat myth, and especially chapter 12.
Mm,
It's wonderful imagery, wonderful imagistic language. Now, in Daniel, it seems clear that Daniel was telling people, do not go out and join the Maccabees.
Mm.
And I think also John thought that, if you are to be killed, let yourself be killed. Because if you are killed, then you rise again. And then that's the important thing.
And let me mention also that you have written a substantial commentary on the book of Daniel, but in
Indeed.
Hermenia series. So both your wife and yourself have done apocalyptic books, done very substantial commentaries.
We have indeed, yes. Yeah.
And it really struck me what you just said. Daniel is, and then it's saying do not join the Maccabees because yes, because it's very pacifist, very pacifist.
Yeah.
Well, the Maccabees were they were the guerrilla fighters.
Yeah. Well, but I mean, when you say that Revelation is pacifist, it
Mm,
means you're counting on God to do the fighting for you.
mm.
Uh, you still want your enemy to get killed.
Psst.
It's not. I don't think this is the way Jesus was thinking about it.
Mm,
When Jesus said, "Love your enemies,"
mm,
well, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, they say, "Return evil to no one until the day of vengeance."
mm,
And in the Dead Sea Scrolls, they figured on the day of vengeance, all bets are off. You can join in. I think in Revelation, on the day of vengeance, you just let Jesus do it.
mm. Even though we come with him according to Revelation, he is the one slaying everybody,
That's
not
right.
us.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow, we're just looking at this Jesus, which it's covered in blood,
Yes.
as in
Yeah.
Revelation, which is uh, which we think is because of the. I mean, I've been taught because of the sacrifice that he did, but actually he's slaying people,
Yeah.
so he's gonna.
Yeah. But it could be some other people's blood too.
Yes, yes, that's amazing.
Well, I think I'll need to let you go to work here.
No, one more question, if you may,
Yeah.
if because I still have
Yeah.
five more minutes. Um, what about apocalyptic then in the New Testament? Within the New
Oh,
Testament,
in the
yes,
rest of the New
yes,
Testament, this is a very controversial thing
yeah, okay,
because uh, in the rest of the New Testament, now you don't get revelations like you do in John,
mm,
but you have Jesus talk. The most controversial thing is when he talks about the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven. Now, that's, I think, clearly an allusion to Daniel, at least in most cases. And it is, uh, it's predicting a final judgment.
mm,
Now, was that actually what Jesus himself was preaching? And that is the issue on which New Testament scholars split down the middle.
mm,
And now there was a strong movement. There was a Jesus seminar
yes,
about 20 years ago that got a lot of publicity. Now, the main people in that just imagine Jesus as a quite modern kind of humanist, who wasn't into any of that stuff at all. But then, on the other hand, you have to wonder if he didn't have any such ideas, why did all his followers get such ideas? Where did
mm,
they get them? So now, there's of course what I'd call a conservative point of view, which says that Jesus said all those things himself and was thinking of himself.
mm,
That I think is problematic too. But there is a third way, which is to say that Jesus did talk about the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven. Now, he may not have said all the sayings that are now reported in the Gospels, but at least that he talked about that. But he did not, at least, make clear that he meant himself.
mm,
Now, he could have been evasive on it. He could have just talked about the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven. I don't think there's any evidence either that he said, and that's not me. But you see, I figure if Jesus was walking around in Jerusalem, why would anybody think of him as the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven?
Mm.
To identify Jesus with the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven only makes sense after the resurrection.
Okay.
And so I think it's not until after the resurrection that that identification is made. The
It
great
makes
question, though,
sense.
is how much of that was part of the teaching of Jesus. And this is where I'm glad I'm not a New Testament scholar.
Uh,
I
it
get
makes
up.
sense. It makes sense when the in the book of Acts, the last thing that Jesus does as with the disciples is that he goes up in heaven and the cloud um, covers him. So from coming, and he's gonna come back. The two angels say he's gonna come back the same way.
Yeah.
So with clouds,
But
so the Son
what
of Man.
goes up must come down, right?
Yes,
What goes up must come down, like
yes,
Elijah.
yes.
Mm.
Well, thank you, Professor. After we finish, can you give me just 1 minute when I close down and I just so this is the book in Spanish, La Imaginación Apocalyptic, which is not so imaginative because when you go in the English, apocalyptic imagination, which is the same thing, La Imaginación Imagination Apocalyptica Apocalyptic. So this is the book. You find the links down on the notes of the video, both for the Spanish and the English one. Thank you, Professor. Thank you for your time, and thank you for your wisdom. And hopefully, we can do this again sometime in the future.
Right.
Thank you.